And I don't know how much you know about what happened in World War II and the Holocaust. That was over 75 years ago, and lots of other things have occurred, and there's stuff going on right now which is crazy in itself. But when it comes right down to it, we're talking about things that happened a long time ago. But the problem is, or the glory is, or the wonder is, that what we're talking about has application to our lives today. Because there are people in Africa just a few years ago that were being discriminated against. There were people in Europe that were subject to something they called ethnic cleansing, which was killing people. There were people in Asia that were killed because of who they were as a people or have a certain religion. And what we're going to be talking about today is the fact that there were certain people who had a certain kind of religion that became the focus of a man named Adolf Hitler and the people that supported him, because he used them as a scapegoat. Does anybody know what a scapegoat is? Yeah.
Someone you blame for.
Someone you blame for everything. You know where that came from, that term?
Yeah.
It came from the Bible. It came from the Old Testament, because God had sort of took pity on Abraham, and when he asked him to take his firstborn son Isaac, instead of allowing him to go ahead and sacrifice his son, he made a goat appear in the wilderness with his horns tangled in a bush. And he said, use that instead. Don't use your son. But that was somebody else going through a period where they were looking for a reason to blame or someone to use as a focus of their anger. And so what happened was Hitler was somebody who used that as a way to come to power. He blamed the Jews for everything. And so what we're going to be talking about is not about all Jews and all things, but we're going to be talking about small groups of people. And specifically, we're going to be talking about my mom and dad. My mom and dad were people who lived in a country called Poland, which was in the middle of Europe. They both came from the same city, but they didn't know each other before the war. They met afterwards. You may have heard, I don't know, have you heard how many million Jews were killed in World War II? Yeah, how many?
6 million.
6 million. How big is that? That's a lot. Don't think of it that way. Think of it this way. Do you remember going to Thanksgiving dinner last year? How many people had 5 people at the dinner? Show of hands. How many people had 5 people at your Thanksgiving dinner? Nobody had anybody at Thanksgiving? Come on.
A lot.
A lot. You had more than 5, right? All right, you had 10, you had 15, you had 20 sometimes, right? Okay, what would happen if you came to Thanksgiving dinner and it was just you and nobody else at the table? That would be weird, wouldn't it? Well, what happened was families were killed. And my families were killed. And somehow that came up there. That family is my dad's family. The Shidlovsky family. That was the name that he had before the war. That was the name that I was born with. I was born as Yitzchok Ella Shidlovsky, okay? Why? Because his last name was Shidlovsky, and that was Polish. And it was something that was special because at the time, the name meant something. Later on, coming to the States, my dad was told, hey, that's too big a name. You're going to get your kid in trouble because it's too long. Cut it back. And so he cut it back to Jimmy, somewhere, Lowe, L-O-W-E. Why? There's a lot of stories behind it, but we won't talk about that too much. In this particular picture, you see all the people. This was where my dad got married for the first time. First time before the war in 1937. Why is that a difference? Because none of those people, except those whose arrows, those arrows were pointing at, lived. They were all killed. So you come to the dinner table at Thanksgiving and you're the only one there. And maybe your cousin. And that's it. And there's nowhere to go. There's nothing you can do. How are you going to live? How are you going to exist? Well, what we know is that this guy was my dad. This guy was my uncle. The only two that survived out of that group. Now my mom, we don't have any pictures of her family. I wanted to jump ahead and say there was happiness after the war. This is post-war. This is after they found each other, they got married, they were on their honeymoon. There's one other important person that you have to know took place here. And that was me. That was me as an infant. I was born outside of Munich after World War II, after they got married. And it was a joyous time, but to get there was not very joyous at all. Poland. This is a place that was right between Germany and Russia, or the Soviet Union. They lived in Lodz, this industrial city. And why was this important? Because Poland had resources in iron and in coal. Does anybody know what you can do when you combine iron and coal? What do you get out of it? You get steel. Why is steel important?
For war.
For war. What do you do with steel?
Build helmets, tanks, guns, stuff like that.
That's right. So why did Poland become important? Because they had the resources for war. And both the Russians and the Germans, the Nazis, wanted it, okay? So, going forward, just to give you an idea, this was what the city of Lodz looked like before World War II. And strangely enough, the city of St. Louis looked very much like this and was about the same size. Those are old pictures because this took place a long time ago. Okay, now, to give you an idea about old and young, that was one of the few people that survived, from my mother's extent, the only person that survived. That's my cousin Gene. He's 93 years old right now and lives in Kansas City. That is my dad when he was 10 years old. And that was my cousin Mike, who we saw in a previous picture. Of the family, besides my mom and those three, those are the only ones that survived. We estimate that about 450 people were killed, were murdered, as a result of what Adolf Hitler and the Nazis did. That was my dad, Avron Chilowski, okay? He was one of 8. He was the oldest. They called him the Little Papa because he helped everybody else in the family. He was a kid that got to know a lot about a lot of things. He ended up working with his uncle in a factory that made white goods, which is white shirts and pants and underwear and things. And he got to know a number of things like other languages. He learned Polish and Yiddish and Hebrew and German and Russian. He knew 5 languages. Keep that in mind because it comes into play later on in our story. And he was a man who was very well respected. That's my mother. She was one of 6. She was the youngest. They called her Tilcha or Tillie. She was somebody who was one of 6, and she had brothers and sisters. And she hated going to school. She didn't like it at all. And she felt like there were better things to do. She loved to crochet. She loved to play with toys and things. And the war broke out. She was about 14, 15 years old. So it wasn't a pleasant time. Let's see. Speaking of war breaking out, Poland was between Russia and Germany. And when the Nazis marched in and took over from the south, the Russians came in from the north, and they cut the country in 2. It was an ugly time. It was a horrible time. People really didn't know what to do.
The young people who are in danger, they will rather maybe be killed or taken away to concentration camps. So better is you ran away. We didn't realize we don't have nowhere to run because the whole world was on fire.
The whole world was on fire, which is why I called it this. That was my dad. That was a recording that was done as part of a special project that was sponsored by Steven Spielberg, the guy who did the Star Wars, helped promote the Star Wars sagas and other things, and E.T. And he tried to record the remembrances of people who had gone through the Holocaust in World War II all around the world. And so I've got excerpts of my father talking about his experiences. Here was a man that was talking in his 6th language, English, after the first 5. And he was telling his story. But why? Because it was a story that everybody said had to be told so it wouldn't happen again. When the Germans, the Nazis, invaded Lodz, what they did was they took over and they were cruel to the people, the Jews especially. They were cruel to everybody, but look at this. That was a little patch that was the Star of David that all the Jews had to wear. They investigated everybody. They looked in everybody's baskets and boxes and bags. And this was a streetcar. the kind of streetcar that my grandfather, my mother's father, got on a few days after the invasion. He went on the streetcar, he went off to work, and he was never seen again. And nobody ever knew what happened. That was the first of many things that were going to go wrong. So what would you do? There was no money. Your accounts were frozen. You were Jewish, so you weren't allowed to do certain things. You were limited to where you could go, what you could do, and how you could do stuff. What happened was a lot of people decided what they needed to do was to run, to get away from the big cities. And in some cases, they said, what we need to do is we need to gather all the people in Poland together in order to be able to fight the Nazis, come together in a big group and, hit them back.
Warsaw was the capital of Poland, and over there was the Polish government. And so they called everybody from all Poland. Poland was 30 million people 50 years ago, before the war broke out. So they've been calling everybody who can take a gun or that come back, the reserve, and everybody to come to Warsaw, and over there we stand against the Germans and we will fight.
But that was kind of foolish, because the Germans had spent the time between World War I and the beginning of this war putting together more steel-based armaments. They had more tanks, they had more ships, they had more different kinds of airplanes, and they had practiced in different places. They were almost unstoppable. The Polish army still had large cannons dragged by horses. They had old guns. And while they did make a stand, and it took a couple of weeks before the Polish army was defeated, it was nothing. The Germans just rolled over them. So what was my father to do? Well, he and thousands of others tried to get away. They still wanted to go to Warsaw. And what happened was he ended up going through the woods to a small town on his way to Warsaw. And the fire there is indicative of the fact that he got there on the Jewish New Year, one of the holiest days of the year. And while they were in a group of people who were praying to God for the New Year, the Nazi blitzkrieg, lightning war, hit. They firebombed the village, and the people started running in all kinds of directions. My father helped a farmer and his wife go into the woods by carrying their baby. And when they were all in the woods and the blitzkrieg ended, the farmer said, "Can I help you any way?" And my dad said, "I got to keep going. I don't know where I'm going, but I got to get away." So the farmer gave him some clothes, a little bit of food, and the clothes were like rough farm clothes. There was nothing special about them. And so my dad went on his way. He went through the woods with thousands of other people. They didn't talk to each other much because nobody knew who was going to turn them in. Nobody knew who they could trust. Nobody knew or understood who was an enemy and who was a turncoat. Now, while he was going through the woods, he happened upon a farmer's house, and he tried to knock on the door and say, "I need some help." And when he did, the farmer came out, talking in Polish to him, said, "I can't help you, go away, we don't have any food, you're going to cause a problem for us." And as they were standing there, a group of Nazi motorcycle soldiers came up. The head of the motorcycle group decided that what they were going to do was going to talk to them. And so the Nazi came up to the two of them and started speaking in rapid-fire German. Now this is interesting because the farmer didn't know German, but my dad did. And he translated for him and said, the German officer wants us to go along with him because they're going to round up people and they were going to take them together to someplace else. As much as the farmer didn't want to do it, he had a couple of guns sticking in his face, and so he had to. So they went off, and they gathered people together, okay? And they gathered more people together. And after a couple of dozen, they ended up finding a burned out by the Nazis, church. And they put him there for 2 days, with no food and no water. What are you going to do? And they finally, in the church, came up to my dad saying, "You know how to speak German. Tell them that we need food, and tell them that we need water, and we've got to do something, or else we're just going to die here of starvation." So my father talked to the Nazi officer and said, "This is what we need." And the Nazi officer said, "Okay, I tell you what, it's near harvest time. There are farms all around. Whoops. What we're going to do was going to let you dig out the things out of the ground, and so they dug out the raw potatoes and carrots and things and had that as food. They found some water for them, and then after another day they went on their way to another place, not very more hospitable. It was a prison. And why was it a deal? Because when the Nazis invaded, the prison guards opened up all of the cells and ran away. All the prison guards that were Polish didn't want to hang around. And so they had this huge set of different kinds of prisons that were open. And they used this prison as a way to hold on to the people that the Nazis had picked up on the farms. You can see it's about a 20-foot wall there with barbed wire on top. And what happened was, one by one, prisoners started disappearing. And a guy came up to my dad and said, look, I know that you know a little bit of German and you could help me. I found a ladder, and I think we can get over the wall at midnight when they're not around, because there are not enough of them to be able to cover every single part of the wall. But we got to get out of here, because we're going to be one of the ones that get taken away and we're never going to be seen again. And so my dad said, yes, okay. And so at midnight that night, they went up over one of the walls that had barbed wire on it, and when they got to the top, they were hit with different kinds of lights and sirens and dogs barking. And this is what happened.
When I fell down, I fell on the hedges on the other side. I've been lucky that there were no stones or something, and I fell on the hedges. I've been very badly bruised, my hand, my face, and fell, and was laying over there scared, because I heard people with the dog coming. But I was lucky, nobody was bothering me. I've been laying over there. But when I wanted to stand up, I couldn't walk. My feet was very, somehow I couldn't, because my feet couldn't walk. So I've been crawling in order to get away from this wall. And I've been crawling about an hour or two, and I fell in a roof. I fell in a hole and fell asleep. Just fell asleep. When I woke up, there was nothing around me.
So, here's a man somewhere in northern Poland, totally alone, perhaps wounded, his knees or ankles or something hurting, no food, strange clothes. He's stuck in a hole somewhere in northern Poland. What's he going to do? He's not going to go to Warsaw, because he sees now that the Nazis have got all the major cities surrounded. So he and a number of other people decided they would go to the border between Germany and Russia. And right on the border is a town called Białystok. And there were a lot of Jews in Białystok. And he decided by going to there, he would also be able to speak to the rabbi of Białystok. Why did that matter? Because Jews felt that rabbis were wise people who could help them in times of crisis, to help them make decisions. So he went to the synagogue to talk to the rabbi of Białystok. And he talked to him and said, Rabbi, I have a problem. And the rabbi said, what is it? He says, I am alone. I am away from my family. I don't know what happened to them. I don't want to be away from my family. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I may be killed at any point, but so may they, and I need to get back to them. And the rabbi said, what do you want to do? He says, I want to turn around and go back home. So the rabbi said, what? Go back home. Strange, right? But that's what he did. Why was that possible? Because, strangely enough, the Nazis had allowed the rail lines to continue to run because they wanted to have people coming back together, back to their own homes. And they were getting them on the rail lines for free, saying, you can go as long as you're on your way home. So what happened to him was he got on a rail line, he was dressed sort of like these guys, he looked like other Polish peasants, and he went forward. But that wasn't all. Because they were stopped 4 or 5 times. And the very first time they took all the men off the railroad, they stood them along the rail line, and they went down the line of people that were there, and they were looking for Jews. And they had with them some of those Polish turncoats, those people who would say they could identify the Jews. And what they did was they went down the line, and they said, Judah, 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 the Jew. And those people were each taken out of the line, and they were never seen again. It loaded the folks back up on the railroad cars, and they went forward. And 3 more times they were stopped. And the last time they were stopped, the Polish guy that went down the line and saw my dad stopped, looked at him, and said, in rapid-fire Polish, so what are you doing? Where are you going? What are you going to do? And why was that important? Because what happened was most of the Jews, 80% of the Jews in Poland did not use Polish. They used Yiddish as their own language every day because they were segregated from the rest of the Poles. Everybody kind of lived in their own little enclaves. And so they thought they could trip up this guy if he was Jewish by talking to him in Polish. And my dad, who was very eloquent, knew it very well, one of those 5 languages, spoke to him back in Polish and said, I'm a guy from Lodz and I'm trying to get back to my own family. And the guy stared at him and then went on and let him go. So he was able to escape because of his ability to do that. Here's another reason. My father didn't look characteristically Jewish. He was a short guy with straight black hair, and he didn't have a particularly big nose, and he had hazel-colored eyes. He didn't have brown eyes. They were almost blue. Okay? So he didn't look Jewish, and he could speak the language in Poland, and so he let him go. Whoops. They got back at midnight into the central train station in Lodz. And so what he did was go forward and try and find his family. They all lived in large apartment houses in central Lodz. And he went to the apartment house toward the back where there was an open gate, or there was a gate that he wanted to open, and he knocked on the gate door. But here's what happened.
Of course, the apartment houses have big doors, and it's closed. You cannot go in. You have to have a key. Or there is a janitor that's let you in and let you out. Suddenly I see 2 soldiers have been marching across the street. There was a school. The school have been taking over by the military. And 2 soldiers have been marching, and 1 soldier crossed the street and comes to me. How are you? Where was you? I say, I am a man here from Lodz, and I came back. It was late. I've been with the people out. What are you doing here? I'm ringing the bell. I'm ringing for the janitor. So I say, okay, when the janitor will recognize that you are a tenant from this house, it's okay. You have to recognize I'm not a spy, that I'm not against him. So it so happened, the janitor came out and he said yes. He asked him, and he said, yes, this man lives in this house. So I've been very lucky that I'm in home. When I came home, and I knocked at the door, and I heard my wife answer, my child. It was, I cannot describe you.
This was over 70 years ago. It was his first wife and child. He still felt for them, even though they didn't exist any longer. But he remembered vividly, and he told us his story in his 6th language. Keep that in mind. So he was there in Lodz. They were all together, but things didn't stay the same, because in a few months they were forced into the ghetto. In the middle of winter, in February, they were forced to go into the ghetto. Do we know what a ghetto is? Yeah.
A ghetto is where, like...
Louder.
A ghetto is, like, where they rounded up all the Jews and, like, put them into, like, small, like, complex places, sometimes 3 or 4 families in, like, one house.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, there were approximately 7 people to a room. They were put into an industrial section. They were taken away from their homes, and they were forced into places where they had no kitchen facilities, no bathrooms, nothing but a place to be able to lay their heads if they could. And they were forced into it because there was something that they had to do to clear out all those Jews and put them all in one place. And when you go through the center today, you'll see the corner, a model of one of the ghettos. The ghetto is actually a word that wasn't German. It was an Italian word that was started hundreds of years before that. It was about the place where, it was a dirty place where they made glass that was on an island near the Vatican. And that word ended up becoming more and more used. So the ghetto here was a place where they were all pulled together on sometimes a couple of hours' notice, if that much. And they tried to pull about 142,000 people into a place that was much smaller and had very, very little room. In the ghetto, in this particular ghetto, where they were in Lodz, not in all of them, the guy who headed it up, they created a position for the head Jew, they called him. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to give you materials, cloth, leather, a little bit of metal, and you're going to make boots and hats and uniforms for us. And we'll exchange the boots and hats and uniforms for food for your people in the ghetto. It was a trade-off because it was all they could do. And so what happened was, a lot of these people were working at that, but what these are what we call propaganda shots. You know what propaganda is? Somebody else. Yes?
Isn't it...
Louder.
Isn't it when the government tells their people something that isn't true to make them work?
It's a way of talking about things that aren't necessarily true, but are to your advantage, whatever it is. Propaganda is all about a marketing campaign that tries to convince you of something which somebody else wants to see happen, or has happened, or is so, when it really isn't. And this wasn't that clean or that nice. The Jews weren't all just nicely dressed, all clean, and everybody was hunky-dory, and everything was happy and wonderfulness. This was something that they wanted to show the world. Why? Because they were careful not to make it look too bad, because they didn't want the world to think badly of them at the time. At the time, the Nazis cared. But what happened was it got worse in the ghetto. The Nazis didn't want to give over food that was going to be used for their soldiers, so they gave less and less to the people. There were these soup kitchens where people gathered round in winter to try and eat things. They had to get things and go to them from their crowded apartments. People died, and these were the orphans that were left over. It was a horrible, crowded, disgusting place. Many people died, 10, 20,000 people or more, because by the time the war was through, that 142,000 actually had more than 400,000 people go through in the course of the years. And a lot of them died, a lot of them were sent on to other places, but the only thing that was uniform was it was a bad place to be. It was a horrible place to be. People tried to adapt. Jews hopefully turned to their religion and said, you know, maybe I can find a way to keep track of what's going on and keep my faith in God, which was very hard. And they tried to do things like hold different services and make things right and as normal as possible. Part of the normalcy was there were at least 3 different hospitals in the Lodz ghetto. And at first they had medicine and they had clean sheets and they had places people could go. But what happened as the war went on, all they had were places. They had no medicine. Sometimes they had doctors or nurses, but the nurses and doctors couldn't do anything because there was no way to help you with your diabetes, with your cut foot, with something that happened to your head if you fell down and hit it, with pains in your stomach that occurred that nobody could do anything about. Basically, the hospitals were just a place you went to die. And my father had his father get very ill.
So I took my father on my back and I said, I will take you to the hospital. And I've been walking. And suddenly I see a big wagon which was delivering coal to the hospital with horses. 2 horses in the wagon, in the men. And it was a big wagon, a big one, which had been delivering coal to the institutions which they needed, let's say the factories. You have to have a kitchen to cook because there have been no kitchens. So this was the place. So I put my father down on a step and I ran after this man and I asked him, please, maybe you can help me to take my father to the hospital. So I say, okay, I'm going in this direction. So I took him again on my back and came and this man helped me and we put him on the coal wagon and we went to the hospital. In short the story, my father died over there in the hospital.
That was my grandfather, who is buried somewhere in Lodz. We don't know where. We don't know how to find him. Life got worse people started getting moved from the ghettos into what they called the transit and the death camps and the work camps. Why? Because they said, as long as you're going to be there, what we're going to do is we're going to work people to death. It wasn't funny. It wasn't easy. It was something that was disgusting and hard. And so what they had to do was to try and pack things up as they were told, and they were told to go places. And a lot of times when they packed things up and they were told to go somewhere, they ended up going to the death camps. That happened to my father's family, and they were sent to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz, Birkenau, was one of the major, largest camps where they had people killed in a variety of ways. My father managed to survive. How? Because he had a skill. He had a skill that used scissors, that used a cutting knife, and used thread and a needle. What he had done was he went forward and he had a needle that he kept hidden under his thumb, under the skin of his thumb, wherever he went, because he could carry it with him that way. And the thread was whatever he could pull off of his uniform or other people's uniforms. And he repaired and patched the guards' uniforms in order to be able to get a little bit more food or a little bit more water. The scissors were something, back then they had these scissors. These are modern versions of it. You see, these are collapsible scissors. And these somehow he put in his belt buckle, and he was able to hold on to. So he used the thread and the scissors to be able to do that, but he needed one more tool. And a couple of years ago, I found this in his boxes of things. What is this? This is a piece of steel that had been flattened out on a railroad track, because he did a lot of work on putting rail lines back together. He took a piece of steel, he put it on the rail track, it flattened it out, and then he honed the edges to be sharper on a stone. And he used this as a cutting edge to be able to cut cloth. It was part of what saved his life, because he got more food and more water. Now, did he keep it all? No, he shared it. He said everybody who is anybody who got their daily ration took their bread or whatever, tore it in half, and put half of it inside their uniform or underneath the head of the place that they slept, and ate only half of it, because they could never be sure where the next day's food and if the next day's food was going to be coming. It was a horrible time. This was something that my dad went through, and my mother went through things like that as well. She was awakened every morning by a woman who came and started knocking a very large stick against the barracks that they were in. And occasionally they hit her over the head and they broke her nose. It wasn't until many years later after the war that she had to have some nasal surgery because of that break. But neither of them knew how bad it really was. They were suffering through it. My mother was in 7 different transit and concentration camps. They took them from one place to another when they needed workers. My father was in 5. But it did come to an end eventually. I don't want to just dwell on it completely. The beginning of the end was when the Allies decided that they could take over Europe and take back Europe from the Nazis, and that's what they did. But it wasn't quite that clean and easy. My mother was finally rescued by Russians that came into a camp and were able to get her and others like her, and they were all very skeletal. You know what skeletal means? They're like skin and bones, okay? My mother was 75 pounds, and they ended up taking her to a hospital. My father had another interesting process that happened to him. My father, we found this amongst his artifacts and things. It was when he was recovering. But what happened was, you see this side here? He was in a boxcar that was blown up by American planes, by American bombers, because it was unmarked. Nobody knew if there was any kind of munitions or soldiers or food for soldiers in there. And so they were told to bomb everything that moved. And so when they bombed that set of boxcars, they blew up a lot of people along the way. My dad was in a boxcar on his way to a death camp. Some people died, and he got blown off onto a hillside. He broke his hip in 2 places. He was recovered by the Americans, and they took him to a place where he could recover. And it took him through the various recovery things. Here are some of the ways that they would deal with people. It took him a year to be able to overcome the problem with his broken leg, and he always had one leg that was about an inch shorter than the other. My mother met my father in the hospital. My mother was looking for somebody from her hometown because everybody in her family was killed. She found my dad, and my dad happened to know by chance one of her brothers. They ended up getting together, falling in love, and they ended up getting married. This is some scenes of my parents plus friends of theirs on honeymoons. What they did was they took the Hitler garden, the Berchtesgaden, the place where he had set aside for himself, and they used it as a honeymoon area for the people that were getting married amongst the refugees. My mother didn't have the greatest time of it, though, because she had 2 miscarriages as they were trying to restore family, and I was number 3. God knows why, but I made it through, okay? My dad ended up becoming a trainer for people who were trying to learn a trade in working with cloth for men and women's clothing, because nobody wanted to send people away without having a special trade, because they didn't want to be dependent upon the country they sent them to on unemployment. And the issue was you couldn't go back to where you were because the Jews had lost their businesses, they had lost their land, they had lost their money, and there was nothing to go back to. So they had to go somewhere else. My father ended up finding one other person, that was his youngest brother, Mike, that we talked about earlier. Mike happened to find a motorcycle, and as a great mechanic, he got it running. He came from what was then Lodz, because he was released from a camp nearby, and went almost 1,000 miles to Munich, in Germany, which is where the displaced persons camp for the Jews that were liberated in many of the parts of Europe came to. And they all got together, not a lot of great smiles, but at least they were alive. That was the important thing. My father ended up coming to New York, my uncle to Melbourne. Why? Because they were deathly afraid that the family was not going to exist. And if they were going to make sure that it was, they were going to have to split up to even go to different parts of the world, because they were terrified that something was going to happen. And they were going to lose the family altogether. Finally got me, and it was quite an effort after a while.
It took me a year to wait in the place over there, a special place, until I got the permission to come to the United States. And because I can only go, my wife wasn't this time pregnant, so she couldn't go on a ship. So she said she had to go with an airplane. So the airplanes which came from here, the big jets, which were bringing things for the American soldiers, have been bringing the refugees from Germany to the United States. So I've been one of them. I waited for a place, and finally it was a place, and they accepted us to come to the United States.
He was one of very few that were allowed to come without having a sponsor. He was able to come because he had letters of recommendation from the people, the military people in the camps he worked in as a trainer, to say he had these skills for garment working, and that he could go anywhere where they needed garment workers, and they would be able to, he would be able to support himself. And that was important. When they went, they didn't go on a jet because, frankly, he misspoke there. They had big transport planes that came in, dropped off stuff for the soldiers after World War II, and picked some people up and brought them back. They went from Munich to Iceland, props, to New York. One thing happened that was interesting along the way. There was a group of Romanian scholars that was with them on the same plane. And they were very, very, ingrained in their religion and their beliefs. And they had gone through hell themselves. And when they got to Iceland, it was Friday night. You know what Friday night is in the Jewish religion? It's the beginning of the Sabbath. And they didn't want to go anywhere on the Sabbath. So they said, we're not going with you. You can't take this plane off with us. You'll have to wait till Saturday night at sundown. So they waited till Saturday night at sundown, and then they went to New York. Look, these folks had gone through hell and back because of their beliefs and their religious beliefs. And what they needed to do was to make sure that they held on to them. And this was one way. My dad and mom went to New York first. My dad hated New York. Here's an example. He went outside. They were in a hotel. He went outside and he saw people like hailing cabs going, hey, 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 what do you think this meant to you? Yeah. Yeah. Now it's a sign to Hitler of Heil. That's it. At least in shorthand in Nazi Germany and in Nazi-occupied Europe, people go, hi, hi. Sometimes they just hi, just a little bit. And he saw that all over New York and he went, oh my God, I just traveled 8,000 miles to come back to hell? Well, it took him a while, but he got to figure out that there was this other issue going on. It was totally different, and it was just a way of saying hello or hailing a cab. That was the thing. But it was terrifying. There were lots of other things they had to overcome, cultural things that were different. My father didn't know the language at that time, and so he started learning the language from what he called the funny papers, the sections of the newspaper on Sunday that had comics. And that's how he started to learn the language. And it was the way that he did that because he had to in order to be able to work. He was asked, where can I go that isn't New York, which is so crazy? He said, go to St. Louis. It has a very large Jewish population by comparison and has the second largest group of manufacturers doing men's and women's clothing. So he came to St. Louis. And it ended up being a pretty good thing. In my own scrawny way, and then my brother, who was available, 5 years later. And we ended up expanding the family back up again. Because remember, we had so many different people in the family, and then 450 were killed. So we started pulling things back together, all kinds of family members in all kinds of ways. It was a wonderful thing to do, and I got married eventually, somehow. And we ended up having our uncle come and see us also. And eventually we went to see our uncle and his family, because he had 2 kids. And unfortunately my mother had passed away by that time, so she couldn't come with us. And this was the most amazing thing of all. Remember, my father had all of these people in his family. He was almost killed any number of times. And this happens to be his first great-grandson. That was at 100 years old that he was able to witness the birth of his grandson, great-grandson. From a place where they were trying to recreate their family and trying to come back to all of this. And by the way, we happened to recover through a whole series of circumstances. That's my great-great-great-grandmother on my father's side. We brought a family back together. It became whole again. It became something that had been destroyed, and we came back.
So when I had this opportunity to go to the United States, so I hang.
Excuse me. Okay. Technology is great until it starts to work against you.
So when I had this opportunity to go to the United States, so I hanged on it, and that was my luck as I came here. Thank God as I came here. If not, I couldn't do this that I did accomplish in my life.
He was among about 300 different survivors that came to St. Louis and restarted their lives over again. My mom and dad were very happy here, and they were able to do a lot of things. One of the things my mom did, though, was she started collecting elephants, because her mother told her that elephants never forget. And she didn't want us to forget what happened to them and what happened to the family during the war. It was very important. And when a lot more reconstruction is done, what you're going to find is there were plaques. This is a plaque for my mother's family, for my father's family, for my mom and dad who have now passed on, and this is for my father's first family. There are remembrances of the way family used to be, and remembrances of a time gone by. We somehow survived. Somehow, in spite of it all. Thanks. I don't know if you have time for any questions or
We
not.
have just maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Sure. If you have any questions, roll them, okay? I'm ready to, yes. Speak loudly.
In the concentration camps, didn't they tell the Jewish people saying Arbeit macht frei or something like that? And it meant
Arbeit macht frei was just a sign that was above the concentration camp entrance to Auschwitz. That was just a phrase. It was a sort of tongue-in-cheek, horrible, horrible, sarcastic phrase. It means work makes you free, which was full of BS, okay? Didn't make them free. Yes?
So was your father also Jewish, or was he just Polish?
No, my father was a Jewish Pole. He was definitely so. And I can say that because I've gone through genetic testing, among other things. I know that to be so, but yes, no. He was somebody who knew 6 languages by the time he finished off here. Yeah?
Jeff, do you have did anybody in your family go to Czechoslovakia?
Go to Czechoslovakia? Actually, no, but we knew people that were Czechoslovak, people who were hidden amongst the partisans in the forest in Czechoslovakia fighting with the partisans in Czechoslovakia. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Wait a second, the lady here.
Did you learn any of the languages that your father?
No, I didn't learn them, but I understand Yiddish pretty well, okay? So it was one of those things, they wanted me to be an American. They didn't want me to be German or Polish or anything else. Yeah.
So, what were the partisans?
The partisans were people who were, call them guerrilla fighters in the war against the Nazis, that usually lived in various places in the woods and would come out and try and attack when they could. The Polish partisans were very strong. There were lots of them. And a lot of Jews ended up joining them if they could escape and get away. Yeah.
Did they transport the Jewish people from concentration camps with like trains and stuff?
Yes, they did. They did that because they wanted to get them in, one of 2 reasons. They wanted to get them in places where they could use them to work them to death, or where they could take them where they could destroy them and kill them. Yeah. Anybody else? One more chance. Yeah.
Did your parents have like the tattoo that said like the number?
My parents did not have the tattoos because they weren't in any one place very long. However, my 93-year-old cousin in Kansas City, because he was 13 years old, has a tattoo right here. And there's a whole story about how he managed to escape and was picked up by American troops and taken to Switzerland. Another one.
Okay.
Okay.
That's probably
Okay, one last.
So, your father got in New York when people were saying hi, he mistook it for people saying other things.
Heil, yes.
Yeah, so he mistook hi for Heil.
Right. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, young man.
Oh,
You were just stretching because you were tired. I understand. You'll be able to get up and stretch some more.
I think that's probably all the time we have.
Okay.
Just